Hi, my name is Jonathan Standing. I'm a freelance concept artist and illustrator. This tutorial is for ImagineFX, issue 118, and it's in response to the question, how do I paint dappled light as if it is falling through trees? The vast majority of this tutorial is really kind of building up the image itself, and it's kind of the last 2 minutes or so are really specifically to do with the dappled light from the trees. I needed an environment to kind of play that idea in. So what you're looking at here are 9 thumbnails that I made for generating this environment. It's another excuse for me to kind of do science fiction big game hunters in an alien forest on a planet somewhere. So that's what these thumbnails are all about. I ended up choosing the thumbnail in the middle row, both horizontally and vertically. I thought it was the strongest composition, and it gave me a large area of kind of negative space in the middle in which I could have sunlight fall through leaves and trees and give us that kind of dappled effect on the ground. Some of the other compositions are interesting and sort of not without their sort of merit, but I thought that one was the best one for the job at hand, so that's the one that I went with. So I made this image in Photoshop CS4, and the video that you're about to see is, for the vast majority of it, 8 times normal speed, and then in places it's 20 times normal speed, just to kind of make it go through fairly quickly, because it took quite a long time to make the painting. But then when we get right towards the end, it'll go in double speed when we address the dappled light. So, moving swiftly on, let's make these thumbnail images go away and switch to the actual Photoshop painting. So what I do here is I select the middle thumbnail, change it to a 16:9 300 dpi image, and I'd made a little library of kind of alien tree shapes. I tried dumping them there into the background just to try and give myself the basis of a bunch of tree shapes to kind of trace over into my drawing. So you can see there I've got the document that I'd made earlier that has the different tree thumbnails. The scale of all of them is relative to one another. I'm using the sort of the largest tree on the left hand side that has kind of the dome shape on the top and the twisting branches underneath. And then I'm using some of the smaller flora from these designs to kind of populate the ground and undergrowth areas of the image. So I've got my overall composition from my thumbnail, and here I'm just making a fairly simple sort of loose drawing of the different elements that potentially I'm going to put in. Trying flipping my canvas here just to see how the composition is working or possibly not working. And then I'm drawing in some more sort of smaller elements. And then here I'm just trying to plop in some tones over top of the thumbnail that I've already established, and then build up some tones for kind of like the specific elements in the image. In this case it's the tree trunk, and then here it's the tree trunks of the trees in the background, a bunch of leaves, and then the canopy of the tree above the 2 figures standing on the rock. Here I'm populating in some tones for the different fungi and smaller plants down on the ground. And then here what I'm trying to do is kind of push some light into the spaces in between the trees in the background, so that we are going to see some sunlight kind of like falling through this tree canopy to give us that dappled kind of effect. This is a fairly sort of like crude painting at this stage, but like really what I'm trying to establish here is kind of the tonal balance of the whole image, while still kind of keeping it faithful to that original thumbnail that I made that was in black, white and middle grey, but here kind of like breathing some complexity and some life into this tonal arrangement where we have a lot more tones and a lot more interest in the image. I flipped the image again here just to kind of work in it the other way around, just to see how it's all kind of hanging together. And I started to dump in some colours in a colour layer here. That's why it looks a bit sort of plastic, the application of colour. Yeah, those purple plants on the right hand side, it's not a very good choice. You'll see in a minute that I get rid of that. But right now I'm just kind of searching for a kind of a colour scheme for the image. So my computer, in its wisdom, lost some of the video footage that happened between the colour image and what we're looking at now. I abandoned the colour scheme that I was putting in there. I didn't think it was that great, and decided to kind of like push the render in black and white a little bit more before I committed a lot more colour work to it. So what I did for a bunch of the details here was I used a photograph of rhino skin on the trunk of the tree, and then some photographs of fan corals for the leaves on the big tree, or sort of leaf clusters, whatever they are. And then I used some grapefruit skin texture on the rocks in the midground, foreground, just to try and like accelerate the development of the image. And then I painted into those textures and really tried to make them a part of the image as a whole. Generally, don't work this way that much anymore, where I make a very rendered black and white image, just because I find colouring it after the fact is sort of a pain in the neck. But I figured I would, for old time's sake, I'd give it a go. Generally, I find it's advantageous to kind of introduce colour as quickly as you can, really, so that you're painting in colour rather than trying to use all of Photoshop's magical trickery to kind of adjust the colours of the image sort of after the fact. But so here I've plunked in a whole series of kind of fungi, some kind of growth or something on the side of these rocks, just to add some extra details and sort of elements to the image. So I do quite a lot of massaging of these larger plants down here in the bottom right hand corner for a little while. For some reason I found those difficult to get right in making this scene. They were really problematic for me. But the overall composition now is pretty much set. I abandoned the line of trees in the background. I felt like we needed to see more sky and kind of see where this dappled light is coming from. And so the idea being that the sunlight is shining kind of through this gap in the trees and through the actual tree canopy itself, and projecting down onto the rocks and plants below. So I've deliberately left the lighting on the rocks just fairly kind of basic. It's all kind of illuminated more or less evenly. You'll see why shortly when we come to kind of make the dappled light on there. What I really needed was kind of a surface that was evenly illuminated, so I can eventually apply some shadow and some light to it to give it that dappled kind of effect. But here I'm still just trying to populate the scene and kind of like build in the different plants and elements and textures and so on and so forth, and still have the composition kind of hold up and be functional, and guide your eye to the focal point, which is kind of like the main rock and the two hunters standing on top of it. So here I'm going back to introducing my colour scheme. I'm working mostly in colour transparency layers here, just dumping in kind of like raw colour into the image just to try and differentiate the different materials and different components in the image from one another. Although, of course, anytime you use a colour layer on top of a black and white image, you have to kind of adjust it after the fact. It feels very, very plastic, because the saturation and chroma of the colour really has nothing to do with the tonal value that's underneath. So it generally needs kind of like a bit of a massage after you've applied your initial colour to make it sort of a bit more functional. So I've given the the leaf shapes on the big tree that blue colour, just to make it obvious that this is kind of like an alien kind of tree. But I've given us a blue sky and some green trees sort of beyond that in the far background, just so that what we have is a mixture of both the alien and the familiar. We understand that this is a jungle or a forest, but it has some elements in it that are alien. Sometimes it's advantageous to have that kind of mixture of the new and the familiar, so that the context in which you're placing the viewer is kind of digestible, but then you're introducing some kind of like new shapes, some new ideas and new colours and so on and so forth, kind of as you go. So here I'm just trying to make it look as if these fungi are receiving light that's falling through the tree canopy, and that we've got some different sort of like interesting hotspots with highlights on them, and then other sections that just kind of fade off into darkness. But also I'm just trying to pump up the saturation of that paint just to try and make it a little bit more interesting. So this is where I devote a ton of time to trying to render these sort of tube flower plant things in the bottom right hand corner of the composition. I wrestled with them a lot. I designed the shape already independently of this image, but I'd never really worked out what the colour scheme for these things was going to be, and you can really tell that I'm just kind of making it up as I go here. For me, I'm a type of artist who likes to try to design the individual elements as much as possible before kind of composing them into a scene, just so I know what I'm kind of putting in there. And so this sort of way of working isn't strictly the way that I like to do it. It's kind of making things up as I go. Here I'm working more or less in flat colour, just kind of laying a brushwork to try and soften the division between some of the colours and shapes that are happening in this larger space. Right now, this group of plants or whatever they are is so strongly silhouetted against the rock behind them that they feel a little bit divorced from the rest of the composition. So one of the things that I try to do is try and bring them back into the image a little bit more by changing the way that they're illuminated, so that they become more a part of the composition and kind of less their own kind of composition lurking in the corner of the image. By having some kind of, I don't know if it's bounce light necessarily, but taking some of the colour of the rock from behind them and projecting them into the shadows, projecting that colour into the shadows on these plants, it kind of helped tie them back into the image. And so here I'm trying to refine the painting of the two characters. I change the colour of their jackets. I begin to lay in some details. As I painted these in, I've not designed these kind of independently of this image, and I'm just kind of spitballing stuff here, which I generally don't like to do. I'd really like to go back and kind of readdress these two characters because I think they look really cheesy. But I kind of did the best of a bad job with these two. Actually, the guy in the flat cap on the right, I don't mind him so much. It's the guy on the left whose pants just turned black that I'm not particularly enamoured with. So I try adjusting the guns there, and that's pretty much it for the figures. So what I'm doing here is using I believe it's a vivid light layer, to pump some more blue from the sky into the background trees, and then also to have some of that blue light kind of actually push through the canopy of the tree kind of in the midground, and then to have it fall on the rocks in the midground. So I'm trying to tie these two areas of the composition together by having them share that distribution of colour. And so this is really where I'm trying to address this idea of dappled light falling on these rocks. I'm trying to close off some of these lighter areas by darkening them and introducing this green tint to the shadows in these areas. And so here what I'm doing is in a multiply layer with my green color selected, I'm actually just painting in now the shadows of the tree canopy that's sort of looming over this larger piece of rock. So I'm trying to lay in these shapes and sort of make them interesting and make them feel like they're the shadows of leaves or branches. But I'm not going to sweat the shapes of them too much. This is the type of work that it's really advantageous to work subtractively, where you lay in some information but then you use your eraser tool to actually sort of punch holes in it, because really in this case the negative space, the holes if you will, in these shadows are really the part that's sort of most interesting and kind of most significant. So even though I'm trying to like lay in some shapes here that I think are good for this shadow, it's when I use my eraser tool eventually to kind of knock some negative shapes out of them that it's really going to kind of take on the character that it'll have for the final phase of the image. So here I'm choosing a cool eraser shape. It's my cloud brush, but using it as an eraser. And here I'm just beginning to kind of either reduce the volume of the shadows or kind of solidify the sections where I think there should be shadows. It's kind of doing both things, toggling back between the brush and the eraser, just to strengthen the shape of these shadows and make this component of the image more exciting and more functional. So I kicked around the idea here of having some sort of God rays, if you like, shining through these hotspots in the canopy. So I made a selection here, feathered it, and then started to paint some light shining through. But I think that what happened was that the composition itself was already more than sort of complicated enough without adding in this extra sort of visual element, this distraction. So even though I kind of tinkered with the idea, I think I just abandoned it in the end as being not the best idea in the world. And so here I'm tweaking some of the smaller shapes and details. The image is more or less done. I've got these kind of hotspots of light shining through the canopy now, creating this mottled kind of shadow down on the ground. But here I'm just trying to address some of the smaller elements, like having some kind of bluish sort of bounce light maybe shining up onto the underside of this tree trunk, just to try and marry some of these elements together. And one of the things that really bugged me about the central figure with the upright pointing gun is that the gun itself never really felt very convincing. So I think what I do in a second is kind of adjust the angle of it to try and make it more satisfactory. It still isn't quite right at the end, but I think it's better the way it ends up than it is now. So what I've done here is selected the shadow in my multiply layer, inverted that selection, and then painted a bunch of highlights into a soft light layer just to bring up the contrast in this dappled light on the rock. And then using kind of like a particle brush, if you like, I've just done some floating sort of dust motes and stuff floating around in this jungle atmosphere. And then, I tilted the gun there onto a sort of 45-degree angle, and I think, well, those characters are definitely not perfect. It's definitely an improvement. And so that's how I made the dappled light on the ground and shining through the tree canopy. So I hope it was useful. Thanks for listening.